Sometimes you stumble upon a question and it just kind of blows open a whole can of worms.
Right.
It's kind of where we are today.
Yeah.
We're going deep on something that sounds pretty straightforward at first, but like the language we use when we're talking about autism
Yeah.
and, the whole person with autism versus autistic person debate, we got a ton of listener questions about it. And you're awesome. You put together some really interesting articles and research for this.
Yeah, happy to. It's fascinating, right?
Totally.
It's not just about the words themselves,
Right.
It goes way deeper than that. It gets into how people with autism see themselves and how they want to be seen, by everybody else.
Yeah.
It's about identity. It's about how people perceive themselves. And it's even about how society, as a whole views autism.
Yeah. And one of the things that really stood out to me going through the stuff you sent was this history of person-first language and how it kind of goes back to the medical and scientific communities. Like, it's similar to how doctors would talk about, a person with diabetes.
Yeah.
Putting the person first and the condition second.
Exactly. The whole idea was to not define somebody by their diagnosis,
Yeah.
Moving away from that kind of language that
Yeah.
could be seen as dehumanizing. And for a while, this approach was like the gold standard, especially in professional settings.
Right, absolutely. But then things started to shift, and the research you sent over highlights this shift beautifully.
Yeah.
There's this rise of identity-first language, and this seemed to be largely driven by self-advocates within the autism community.
Yeah. And this is where it gets really interesting, right?
Totally.
Because for a lot of autistic individuals, autism isn't something separate from who they are. It's like it's part of their identity. Like it's woven into their very being. It's not something to be ashamed of or downplayed.
One of the researchers you shared said it really well. It's about reclaiming the narrative.
Oh, yeah. I love that.
And I think that's so powerful because it's about, autistic people defining themselves on their own terms.
Absolutely, yeah. And when we look at this in a broader context, I mean, we see these kinds of shifts happening with language around other identities all the time.
Yeah.
Think about, the evolution of terminology within the LGBTQ plus community, for example.
Oh, absolutely.
Language is constantly evolving to reflect how people understand themselves and how they want to be recognized by the world.
So it really highlights this idea that we can't assume we know the right way to talk about someone's identity, right?
Exactly.
We have to listen. We have to learn.
Yeah.
And be open to kind of evolving our language as our understanding grows.
I got it. And that's what this whole deep dive is really about, right? It's
Yeah.
less about, finding one right answer and more about like understanding all the different nuances and perspectives
Yeah.
and the importance of just talking about this in a way that's respectful.
Yeah, respectful dialogue for sure. And, you included some firsthand accounts from autistic individuals in the research that you sent, and they talk about why they specifically prefer identity-first language.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of them said something that really stuck with me. It was about...
Oh, I think I know which one you're talking about.
Yeah.
The young woman who said, saying autistic person acknowledges that autism is part of who I am, not something separate from me.
Yes.
It's not a burden. It's part of who I am.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And it made me think so much about how powerful language is
For sure.
because it shapes perception, not just for the individual, but also for society.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this whole discussion so crucial, right?
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that language actually has an impact, like a real impact on how we understand ourselves and how we treat each other.
It's about creating a world where everyone feels seen and heard and respected.
Exactly. Yeah.
And one of the studies you shared was published in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. And they found that using identity-first language was actually associated with like higher self-esteem and a greater sense of belonging among autistic individuals.
It is. And that finding really kind of drives home the point that language isn't just about semantics, right? It has real consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely.
Choosing to use language that aligns with someone's sense of self can have a really positive impact on how they feel, about themselves, on their well-being.
So it's not just about being politically correct.
Right.
It's about like being genuinely thoughtful and respectful.
Exactly. And that respect starts with acknowledging that there's no one-size-fits-all answer, right?
Right.
Different people within the autism community will have different preferences.
Of course.
What feels empowering to one person might not feel the same to another.
Absolutely. And this is where active listening and open communication becomes so important. Because we can't just assume we know someone's preference. We need to ask. We
Yeah.
need to be willing to learn.
And sometimes it's about being willing to have those conversations that are a little bit uncomfortable,
Yeah.
where we admit we don't know everything and we're open to evolving our understanding.
I think that's a great place to pause for now.
One of the articles you sent, it talked about how autism has been, portrayed in media and popular culture.
Uh-huh.
And for a long time, autism was shown in a really limited way,
Yeah.
focusing more on the challenges,
Right.
rather than the strengths and the diversity within the autistic community.
It's like it was always presented as something that needed to be fixed or overcome
Yeah,
rather than just a natural part of who a person is.
exactly. And that kind of framing, it can really affect how people with autism view themselves
Yeah.
and how other people see them too.
It makes me think about that quote from Steve Silberman's book, Neurotribes.
Oh, yeah, great book.
You highlighted it in your notes. He said, the neurodiversity movement is about shifting the focus from fixing autistic people to supporting them and valuing their unique contributions to society.
Such a powerful quote. And it really gets at the heart of why language is so important here.
Uh-huh.
By using identity-first language, we're not just acknowledging their autism.
Right.
We're affirming their right to define themselves,
Totally.
on their own terms.
It's about recognizing that neurodiversity is just a natural part of human variation.
Yeah,
It's not something to be like, pathologized or erased.
for sure. And it's about challenging those assumptions that equate difference with being deficient.
Yeah, totally. One of the studies you included looked at how different language choices affect the way people perceive individuals with autism.
Uh-huh.
And the researchers actually found that when people were exposed to identity-first language, they were more likely to see autistic people as competent and capable.
Yeah, that's a really important finding, right?
Yeah,
Because it suggests that language can actually shape our perceptions and attitudes.
right.
So by using language that respects and affirms someone's identity, we can help to create a more inclusive and accepting society.
So it's not just about being like nice
Mhm.
or trying not to offend anyone.
Right.
It's about actually like actively working to dismantle those harmful stereotypes
Yes.
and to create a world where everyone can thrive.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that language has the power to shape how we understand the world and to create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
Thinking about all of this, it makes me realize that, learning about and using respectful language, it's just one step in the process of becoming an ally.
Yeah, that's so true. It's important to remember that language is just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
True allyship means continuously learning, listening, and taking action.
It's about like amplifying those voices,
Yeah.
advocating for policies that support inclusion and accessibility, and challenging discrimination and prejudice, whenever we see it.
Absolutely. And allyship is a journey, right?
Yeah.
It's not a destination. There's always more to learn, more to unlearn, and we all have a part to play in creating a more inclusive world.
One of your sources mentioned the concept of nothing about us without us,
Oh, yeah.
which comes from the disability rights movement.
Such a crucial principle in disability advocacy. What it means is that, the decisions and policies that affect people with disabilities,
Yeah.
those decisions should be made with their involvement,
Absolutely.
with them in a leadership position.
It's recognizing that people with disabilities are the experts on their own lives, on their experiences,
Yeah.
and their voices need to be front and center in any conversation about disability.
Absolutely. And that goes for the language we use too. It's
Yeah.
about deferring to the preferences of autistic individuals and respecting their right to self-determination.
In the notes you sent, you included a link to the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network's website.
Oh, yeah, it's a great resource.
It's such a fantastic resource for learning more about autistic perspectives
Okay.
and advocating for disability rights.
They have a whole section on language and identity that's super informative.
Yeah.
They give really practical guidance on respectful language choices, and they talk about the importance of centering autistic voices.
It's a good reminder that education and allyship are journeys,
Ongoing, for sure.
and there are always opportunities to learn and grow.
And those opportunities, they often pop up in those moments of discomfort,
Yeah.
when we're forced to confront our own biases and assumptions.
It's about being open to having those difficult conversations
Yeah.
and listening with empathy and humility.
Yeah.
and being willing to change our perspectives.
And those are the conversations that lead to greater understanding and connection
Yeah.
and progress.
One of the sources you sent was a blog post written by an autistic self-advocate.
Uh-huh.
And they talked about moving beyond just tolerating autistic people
Yeah.
and actually getting to a place of genuine acceptance and celebration.
I love that. Tolerance just means like passively accepting difference.
Right.
But true acceptance is about embracing and valuing neurodiversity
Yeah.
as a natural part of what it means to be human.
It's about recognizing that autistic individuals aren't just people with autism.
Right.
They're unique and they're multifaceted individuals.
Yeah.
And they have their own strengths and talents and perspectives.
Absolutely.
And it's about creating a society that values and celebrates those differences.
Sure.
Rather than trying to erase them or minimize them.
Exactly. It's about shifting the focus from fixing people to creating a world where they can thrive.
When they can be their full selves.
Yeah.
And reach their full potential. It feels like, we've only just dipped our toes into this.
Yeah, for sure.
This whole discussion, it's so complex and it's constantly changing too.
It really is. And that's part of what makes it so interesting, right? I mean, it's about language, but it's also about so much more than just the words themselves.
Right.
It's about like identity, respect, and creating a world where everyone feels like they belong.
You mentioned earlier that language is constantly evolving.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder about the future, like what's going to happen with the language we use when we talk about autism in the future?
It's a great question. And I mean, I don't think anyone has a crystal ball.
Right.
But, if we look at how language around other identities has changed, it seems likely that the language we use to talk about autism will keep evolving too.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting to see how the conversation changes and how autistic people continue to shape the way we talk about their identities.
Absolutely.
I think the most important thing is to be open-minded.
Yeah.
And be willing to learn and adapt.
We got to stay informed, listen to autistic people, and be ready to challenge our own assumptions and biases.
For sure. One of the things that really struck me from all the research you shared was the emphasis on individual preferences.
Yeah.
What feels respectful to one person might not feel the same to someone else, even within the autistic community.
Absolutely. And it really highlights how important open communication is.
Yeah.
And being willing to ask questions and learn from each other.
It's not about finding the perfect words or like sticking to a rigid set of rules.
Right.
It's about approaching every conversation with a real desire to understand and respect the individual.
So much of it boils down to being mindful, be intentional with our language.
Yeah.
Because words have power.
Oh, they absolutely do. Language can be used to like uplift and empower people.
Yeah.
Or it can be used to, push people to the margins, to exclude them.
Right.
It's our responsibility to use it thoughtfully and to fight for language that promotes inclusion and respect.
One of the sources you sent, an article from the Autism Society, it suggested some really practical tips for engaging in respectful dialogue about autism.
Yeah, I remember that. They recommend asking individuals how they prefer it to be addressed, being aware of the language we use in public and avoiding language that kind of plays into stereotypes or reinforces negative ideas about autism.
It's all about making a conscious effort to create a more welcoming and inclusive environment.
And remembering that it's an ongoing process, right?
Yeah.
There's always more to learn, and we all have a part in creating a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued for who they are.
I think that's a great point to end on. This deep dive has been incredibly insightful.
I
It's given me
agree.
a lot to think about, and I'm sure our listeners feel the same way.
I hope so. And this isn't a conversation that just stops when the podcast ends, right?
Right.
It's a conversation that needs to keep going.
Yeah, in our families, in our workplaces, in our communities. So to wrap things up, let's leave our listeners with this thought. Be curious, be respectful, and be open to learning and growing.
Well said.
The more we understand each other, the more connected and compassionate our world becomes.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And don't forget, there are some amazing resources out there to help you keep learning.
Yeah.
Organizations like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network and the Autism Society are great places to start.
That's a great point. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.